Thank you for joining us in this session. This is the REGTECH and Regulator session, and I will introduce to you our fantastic panel in a second. We will be talking primarily about what is a regulator doing in this space at the moment, what initiatives do we think have worked really well, and where do we think the regulator should focus going forward. As I've already been introduced, I'm one of the partners in our risk function at EY, working very closely with Mike. I'm really delighted to be joined by an excellent panel who I've decided to introduce because I'm sure they'd be far too modest if they were introducing themselves. So I'm going to start with Peter, if I may. So Peter Thomas from the Bank of England focuses on data innovation from a prudential perspective. Peter has experience in central banking and financial regulation for over 8 years. He has a degree from the University of Oxford, very impressive, in history and politics, and also worked in the House of Commons. Peter, we're really looking forward to your thoughts on regulation and regulatory initiatives in this space. Also delighted to introduce Nicole Sandler from Barclays. Nicole, another incredibly impressive CV. So you're the innovation lead at Barclays, innovation policy lead at Barclays. Nicole's focus has included policy on crypto assets, DLT and AI. You've also sat on multiple panels, so thank you for joining us in this one, with policy leads and regulators across the globe. And it's always fantastic to be able to say things like, Nicole is one of the Innovate Finance, I get the wording right, Power List for Women in FinTech. So she was on that list in 2017 and 2018, which I think is fantastic. So thank you again, Nicole, for joining us. And Mike Hickey, again, thank you for joining us, Mike. Mike is a partner director at Xceptor, which is a RegTech organisation who is doing work with EY at the moment, so enjoying working with you and the team, Mike. Mike has over 20 years of experience in this field, and his firm, and I know Mike will talk a little bit more about this as well, but focuses on bringing data together for process automation, and you've done work on Solvency II and MiFID implementations as well. So, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Looking forward to your thoughts on these questions. I'm going to start with you, Peter, if I may. And I've got a question about really the Bank of England's approach to regulatory initiatives. We've had Chris Woolard from the FCA this week talking about recent developments, including the first Green FinTech Challenge, the update on the Sandbox for Cohort 5, and various other initiatives. Can you give us a sense of what the Bank of England is doing in this space?
Sure, okay. It works. So, Bank of England, obviously, we work very closely with the FCA. We have a different population of firms. So the FCA supervise, at last count, I think, over 56,000 firms. We supervise about 1,500, and obviously we look at it from a prudential perspective rather than a conduct lens. That means we look at different issues, but we collaborate very closely on a number of different initiatives. So we work with them on the Sandbox a little bit, but actually work with them more closely on, I think someone mentioned, the previous speaker was mentioning, digital regulatory reporting. So we share a lot of reporting systems with the FCA, we collect all the same data, and we're looking at ways to try and collect that and use that more efficiently and effectively. In my own particular area, I focus on helping the PRA. I run a team that try to help the PRA. We say find, fix, and explore new ways of using data within the PRA. It's a little bit of a geeky motto, but it kind of covers roughly what we do. Basically, that's all about how we use Xceptor and how we use data and data science to mine the incredibly large amount of data that those incredibly large amount of rules send to us, and a lot of people in this room, we will be involved in that process. We do also work very closely with other parts of the Bank of England. So we have a FinTech hub who run a number of POCs, and formerly as a FinTech accelerator. And so some of you may have been involved in those POCs looking at a whole host of different things, from applying machine learning to bits of our market infrastructure data, right through to experimenting with DLT and blockchain in this sort of RTGS, real-time gross settlement space. So lots there. I think the final thing that I kind of finish on, and maybe that's kind of specific to us as a central bank, is that we see the RegTech work that we do very much as part of a broader FinTech agenda that we have. So we are trying to understand how the external market is changing, because that affects how we do monetary policy, it affects how we do markets and banking services, it affects how we look at financial stability, as well as the microprudential regulations, which is where I sit. So we're looking across that waterfront. For us, RegTech is part of that. It's part of a much wider FinTech environment that we're looking at, and we're really, really keen to engage with as many people as we can, both in the UK but also globally as well, to understand those changes, whilst also still being, as I'm sure you understand, a fairly risk-averse central bank, like most central banks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. Just a short follow-up question. So one of the things that firms had to respond to over the last week was the questionnaire on ML and AI. And again, is this about understanding the evolving nature of what's happening in the industry, and where do you want to go with that?
Sure. Okay, so that's really helpful. So that's a very specific example of that wider waterfront that we're looking at all the time. So we are really interested, and hence why we're sending people surveys and questionnaires, and I apologise if there's lots of I'm sure lots of people do this to you all the time. I know we send out a lot of requests for information. We do use it, we're not just doing it for fun. The genuine idea of that is to try and understand what sectors of the financial system are being affected by this new technology at different times, how is it being taken up, what areas are being developed, what do we see changing. We obviously have supervisory relationships with those 1,500 firms, but that's just a small part of a very large financial services system, which is a part of a much wider UK economy. So we collect data on that all the time, and that is exactly what that survey is for. It's a follow-up to a survey that some of you may have filled in 2017. So it's sort of the next iteration of that, and it also helps us to understand ourselves what things we may could use internally as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Nicole, I'd like to come to you, please, to ask a question about the impact regulatory initiatives have had in the RegTech arena. And I know Barclays has been involved in multiple of these. Can we get your views on what you think has worked well?
So I know that Peter's mentioned the Sandbox interview. Just out of curiosity, how many people in here know what the Sandbox is? And I don't mean a place where you go and play in sand, because the actual Sandbox has no sand in it, most disappointingly. Okay, so for those of you that don't know what a regulatory sandbox is, and it's totally reasonable that you don't, it's a safe space for companies, firms to go and test innovative solutions with the FCA or another regulator, essentially holding their hand throughout. That's it in its simplest form, but there is no sand. So Barclays participated in cohort 2 of the regulatory sandbox, and I personally think that's one of the best initiatives that you will see across jurisdictions. The FCA were the first to launch their sandbox, but it exists in Singapore, it exists in Hong Kong, it exists in Australia. The Europeans have been slightly behind because they've taken a more, I don't like to use a negative, but they've been a bit more cautious where it comes to sandboxing. And I openly say this to the FCA, so it's not going to come as a surprise. It's not that it was their fault, but when they put out what their tools were, so within a sandbox you have tools, and their tools were individual guidance, waivers, and no action enforcement letters. So some of the Europeans turned around and said, well, hang on, you're going to waive regulation, and you're going to give a letter which says you're not going to enforce if Barclays does something wrong. And they thought, well, we don't like that. That makes us very uncomfortable. We don't think that works. How many of you in the room think that waivers or no action enforcement letters have been used by the FCA? Perfect. Not once. They've only used individual guidance because it's very difficult. If I at Barclays was going to breach something, we're not going to breach something, it's very unlikely that it will be an FCA regulation. Our issues would come somewhere else. We would have no issues. And you wouldn't be able to, and if you were going to say you're not going to enforce on something, well, if it's something that's gone wrong on the data side, again, the FCA doesn't have the remit to do that. So the Europeans were like, this is a bit of a problem, we don't really want to be following suit. That has actually been changing in recent months, that they now actually have their own European sandbox, or they haven't quite called it a sandbox, but that's the route that they're going down. There's also the Global Financial Innovation Network, again, which was, I want to say it was set up by the FDA because it was set up by the FDA. It now has, I think, 35 different regulators on it. Again, it's slightly lacking on the European side and also on the US side, but across APAC, across the Middle East, it's very well represented. Now, the reason I particularly like the sandbox is because as a bank or as a startup, you're going in and you're sitting down with your regulator and you're explaining what it is that you want to be testing. Now, I'm a lawyer by trade. I don't like to say that too openly because I do very little law these days. But how I read a regulation is probably going to be very different to how you read a regulation. Potentially how you read the regulation, and also how the FDA may be reading the regulation in line with the test that I'm putting out. But if you're able to sit there with your regulator and say, okay, how do you view your regulation in line with my test? And they can give you the answers, and you can go, okay, or you can go, well, actually, that's not how we wanted it to work, that's not how we thought it was going to work. And you can have a very open dialogue. That's very useful, whether you're a bank, whether you're a startup, whether you're an insurance company. One of the criticisms we heard quite early on was sandboxes were just for startups. And I turned around and said, well, I work at a bank, and I love the sandbox. Actually, where you'll find, for me personally, where I think the sandbox will work best is when it's a startup and a firm working together with the regulator. And where I think the sandbox actually works best, put aside the startups, put aside the firms, it's actually for the regulator. Because they're able to see where a test will hit their regulatory perimeter, and that gives them a much better understanding of the policy they may need to put forward. So, for instance, the crypto asset consultation that came out recently from the FDA, that was off the back of the crypto asset task force, but also off the back of a number of sandbox tests. That's excellent. The same for RegTech. So the DRR reporting, there was actually stuff going on in the sandbox at the time which was helping feed into the DRR reporting. And that was actually also partly one of the things that Barclays was working on in the sandbox, was a RegTech solution which very neatly fitted into then working on the DRR initiative. So that's where I see a sandbox being particularly helpful. I may sound like I'm being very harsh against the Europeans. I'm not. I love working with the Europeans. I love working with the Commission. That's not me being sarcastic. I genuinely do love it. My husband does query this, but it's factually correct. So one of the things I really like that the Commission does is they have an EC FinTech lab. The EC FinTech lab is where they bring in regulators from the currently 28 member states, and they take whether it's they might look at blockchain, or they might look at AI, and they have regulators talking on this, and they have firms talking on it, and it's to educate the people in the room. In June, their EC FinTech lab is on RegTech and SubTech, because they understand the importance of what RegTech can do for them and what SubTech can do for them, and they want to be talking about this with their regulators in the different member states and educate themselves further. Because at the end of the day, they need to educate themselves further. As an industry, we need to educate ourselves further. So that's essentially what they're doing with the EC FinTech Lab.
Really insightful. Thank you very much, Nicole. I think it's really positive to hear, your thoughts, which are really around, look, there's some good things going on out there, but everybody's still learning. So the firms, the RegTechs, and the regulator, and engaging is really important thing to do to help influence the agenda. Mike, I'd really like to get your thoughts as a RegTech organisation around where you think regulatory initiatives have both helped and hindered progress.
Yeah, thank you. That does work to get a bit closer. So on balance, I'd say it's definitely helped. Regulation has helped RegTech companies such as ourselves get closer to our clients and work much more closely. I'll give an example in a second, but there's probably a couple of layers to this question or my reasoning. I think, firstly, the regulation, what it's done is it's created a burden for banks and insurance. That's where we work. And it's a burden of work that they can't do without innovation, without technology, without vendors such as ourselves, and remain competitive. So that's one thing, and just the number of RegTech organisations here and out in the world just confirms that there's a need there that our organisations are meeting. But it's more complicated than that, because what we find, and certainly what works well, is these regulations tend to have deadlines. And you've got to be ready and compliant by a certain time. And you can't just say, well, it'll work, and we've seen your solution, and we'll get back in touch in 12 months' time and need to be ready, and everything will be all right in the night. There's a couple of reasons for that. A, you need to test early, and I'm very much Nicholas in agreement in terms of the sandbox environment side. There's an important need to understand at the time what the interpretation is of the regulation early, and then POC it or sandbox it so you can see and understand how that technology is going to work and it will solve the problem. But the interpretation changes. Regulation, the interpretation evolves, more information comes out, requirements change. So where it works really well and what the challenge is that testing and that engagement needs to be a collaborative approach and constant throughout that whole program, not a sort of transactional, well, get in touch in, a month before UAT and we need a different set of, requirements being delivered. So I think that's how it's brought the engagement with our customers more closely together, for the fact that this evolves and you need to test and you need to keep testing. Where it's worked really well is where those line of communications have been very, very open and frank. And the example I'm going to give is in the SFTR regulation, where we worked with the DTCC. And for anyone who doesn't know that regulation, this is straight on the back of MiFID. Any organisations that are trading need to report to trade repositories, and that's what the DTCC is. And SFTR, in a very, very brief way, had a requirement that another 154 data items needed to be reported. Some of those data items didn't even exist for these firms, so they'd have to generate those by sending emails between counterparties. So that created a need to capture this data, but and DTCC were keen to make sure that these organisations could comply, but they didn't want to be at a competitive disadvantage as well, and they're very open with us and saying that they needed this data that was, as I've described, in all sorts of formats out there and some on emails, and somehow they needed to get it into an ISO compliant format to feed into their platform. A nightmare for all these organisations with tight deadlines. So understanding that, what Xceptor does, it's able to capture data. It's AI enabled and set of configurable rules as well, so it can capture that data, be it contracts, PDFs, emails, and normalise it using a set of rules to maybe enrich and validate to make sure it's now accurate, and then feed it into the platform. Why it worked really well? Because the testing, those requirements changed. The testing was constant. The POCs were constant. The lines of communications are constant. But it solved the problem not only for the DTCC, who frankly gained a competitive advantage in the market, but it solved the problem for all their customers overnight, because what they're able to say is, do you know what, just send this data in whatever format you want and we'll sort it out, because we've got a platform that can do that. So I think that's how it works well. It works really well, that constant testing. And I've got a half of another example where I say it's half because it's not concluded, but IBOR transition is another huge challenge and regulatory challenge where the rules aren't quite understood. We had a round table for our clients. There are 26 banks in the room talking about the challenges, and what came out of it is really they don't quite know. And that's why it's so important that these lines of communication are kept open to ensure that, well, this is our understanding now, let's test it. Can you solve this Xceptor? Yes, we can. And then paradigm may shift, some understandings may shift, interpretations may shift, and there's probably 26 different interpretations in that room at the time, but they all shift. But I'm sure throughout that, keeping the lines of communication open, that we'll be able to work together and solve that. So, very long-winded way of saying, yes, it's brought us closer to our clients. I'd love to be in the position of where, in that sandbox environment as well, we're not a startup in around 15 years, but to work with the regulators directly and do that. And I think that's going further up the food chain, isn't it, to solve at source, to help maybe inform the regulation, because they know what's achievable, and then feed that back.
Thank you, Mike. And I don't think it was long-winded at all. I think it just shows the amount of engagement you've had in this space and the detail in which you understand it. So appreciate the comment. One of the points you make is around the evolving regulatory agenda, evolution in terms of technology, in terms of regulation. And if I can ask the audience to please open the polling question. We have a question for you around where you think, given this evolving agenda, and this was very nicely set up by accident, Mike, so thank you, where you think regulators should focus next when it comes to regulatory initiatives. So if you could please answer that question, that would be fantastic. And I would also like to ask our panel the same question. Let's just give people another couple of seconds to respond. But let me read out the question, which is, where do you think it would be... There you go, it's in front of you, there we are. Thanks, Mike. So where do you think it would be helpful for regulators to focus next to support innovation in regulatory compliance and the adoption of RegTech? So really interesting, actually. We're just seeing the results here. Oh, no, they're changing. Okay, let's wait a while. They're changing back. Peter, as that's settling, can I come to you to ask you, where is the Bank of England focusing next?
Okay, sure. So I'm going to quite hard to speak on behalf of the whole Bank of England because there's lots of different bits of that, lots of different bits looking in different areas. And I think depending on where you sit and what function you look at, you'll probably prioritise different things here. If I talk about from my own experience and in terms of the work that I've been doing with the PRA, I think one of the things that we're doing a lot and doing more is probably the orange and the sort of dirty green, if you like, which is the greater collaboration both between regulators globally, but also between different bodies in government and elsewhere. Now, a lot of that is around looking at trying to get towards more universal standards, which I think is like the sort of bedrock of a lot of the kind of RegTech and FinTech that we want to see develop, and we want to be involved in. So we're conscious that, and we speak to a lot of firms and a lot of startups. One of the great complaints is that not only is the regulatory framework very fragmented, but also there are not that many universal data standards to base some of this tech on. And obviously, it would be far easier if there were. There are things we can do, and we're very keen to push forward on things we can do on a UK basis. But we are in continuous dialogue with regulators literally all over the globe, both in Europe but also in the US, in Asia and elsewhere, with a lot of people very keen to work on this stuff. There are a lot of, anyone who's been involved in those sorts of international negotiations knows that they're slow and painful and tricky, and you uncover all sorts of things, some things which have nothing to do with data standards at all, but actually just other issues that you dig up in the process. But I think that's the kind of big area where we're very keen to work more. We're also conscious that as regulators, we're all facing the same challenge. So we are all regulating in an increasingly digital world with with exponentially increasing amounts of data. Our model for regulation and how we regulate has to change as a result. One of the bits that my own team has worked mostly on is around how do we become a sort of digital regulator of the future, and how do we change our operating model as much and our culture as much as our actual sort of data and tech. So we can learn a lot from other areas. We can also learn a lot, I don't think it's on here, but we can learn a lot from other sectors as well. And we speak more and more to other sectors as well as people within the financial service sector as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Peter. Nicole, are you surprised by those results?
I am slightly surprised. I mean, for me, I would say development of new regulation, updating existing regulation to focus on technology-related risks. I would have thought that would be on par with greater collaboration between regulators. And the reason I say that is, so I think I'm quite fortunate. I get to sit on an expert group at the European Commission, which is looking at regulatory obstacles to financial innovation. And the key thing behind that group, which had a few banks on it, has various people across the industry, has some of the ESAs, European Supervisory Authorities, we love an acronym in a bank, is to look at where there are gaps in the regulatory framework, or where, for instance, GDPR may hinder AI, and work out what recommendations we should be giving to the new Commission and the member state regulators around their regulatory framework. And I think that's really valuable because, and maybe, I'm going to say this carefully, I work for a regulated entity. Not everyone in this room may work for a regulated entity, so it may be less of an issue for some people in this room to not have such a strict regulatory framework, whereas I love a very good regulatory framework because if in a bank, if we want to get things done, we need to understand what our regulatory framework is, and if there isn't one, it sometimes makes it very difficult for us to do innovation in certain areas. When I look at greater collaboration between regulators and the orangey one and greater collaboration between different bodies, I mean, I think that's something that has really changed in the last year, and particularly in the last 6 months, where you see a lot more collaboration. So I mentioned the Global Financial Innovation Network, which was set up by the FDA. So that actually houses a global sandbox to do testing across borders, which is really valuable because innovation doesn't understand borders. So it's useful if regulators in different jurisdictions are talking to each other about how their rules potentially may need to be similar or the same. Because if I'm a crypto asset and I go from the UK to Brussels and then I go to Silicon Valley and then I go to Hong Kong and then I go to Singapore, and each time I move, apparently I've changed, but I'm like, I haven't changed. It's quite complicated to work with. So I think the Global Financial Innovation Network is an excellent initiative. The European Commission actually also recently set up an International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications. Please don't make me repeat that. The acronym is INATBA. Now, what I particularly like about this association is it's now run by, I think it's about 120 firms, of which Barclays is one of them. But above it, to the side, this is what made it very interesting, is there's a number of regulators and a number of governmental bodies and organisations, and also standard setters who are involved. So they're referred to as the Governmental Advisory Board. And the idea is that we look at different use cases within this trade, and we feed it up to the Government Advisory Board, what we're finding as things that are working well, or, to be honest, where there are problems, and where they may need to be having discussions with each other. And I think that's really valuable. And one of the things I really liked about it was, and again, I'm not criticising Europe because I really enjoy working with the Commission, but often you will hear them talk about, we need to promote Europe, and I understand that. And by doing so, they only really talk to each other in Europe. Now, that's great to an extent, but the last time I checked, Europe, and I say this very kindly, including the UK, is not necessarily leading in every area of innovation. There are other jurisdictions which are further ahead than us. And therefore, we need to be talking with them to see what their best practices are and what we can learn from them, and then equally what they can learn from us. Now, with INATBA, they didn't go for a European, they went for a global. And one of the first people they spoke to was the Japanese, who are particularly innovative. They've also done that with their own European sandbox. They've turned around and said, well, actually, we'd like to include third countries, because they really like, from what I can understand, working with the UK, particularly when it comes to a sandbox, because they have some of their member states come to them, and especially the Commission, and say, we want to be as innovative as London. What do we need to do differently? And the Commission is around and go, you need to have a sandbox, but we can't force you to have that. So if they're not having the dialogue with the FCA, because I don't want to talk about Brexit, but if we are to leave, we will be a third country. That was one way for the Europeans to say, actually, we'd still like to be interacting with the FCA when it comes to innovation and it comes to sandboxing. So we're going to invite third countries. And that, to me, falls on, and it's now gone, but the interacting with regulators collaboratively and not just within your own jurisdiction. Also long-winded, apologies.
Could we get that graph back up, please? I prefer it to our faces, I think. But I think one of the things which is really interesting about the GFIN as an example, the Global Financial Innovation Network that you're talking about, Nicole, we had quite a lot of interaction with that paper and discussions with the regulator as well. And we issued a 20-page response to say, here's all the reasons we think it's really, really good, but also some of the things that you need to do to make it work, which kind of brings me on to my next question, which is around how quickly regulators are moving. And the link there is about when you've got global forums set up, it feels like exactly the right way to go in this space, but will it take too long? And is RegTech, Xceptor moving quickly enough? Who'd like to answer that?
No, I feel that RegTech is moving reasonably quickly. The DRR reporting, for a regulator has gone pretty swiftly. It's the problem is it's very difficult to move quickly with regulation. How long does one think it takes for a regulation to come out? 1 year? 2 years? 3? 4? 5? The regulatory life cycle can take 5 years for a new regulation to come out. Can you imagine how different the world will look with innovation in 5 years' time. But it's taken the FCA and the Bank of England not that long to be doing stuff in the RegTech space, which I think is very, very impressive. So I'll hand over to Peter to say something about it now.
It's okay. Well, thank you. No, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the point that I was making about sort of common standards and finding problems that aren't data problems in amongst that. We can extract ourselves from the wider legal policy frameworks in which we work, and those are, unfortunately, frustratingly often, and they're frustrating for people who are in them. I used to work in them quite a lot. Everyone finds them annoyingly slow. There are good reasons why they're slow, because actually it takes a long time to build compromises and to get to a position where you can get cross-border agreements. And as you just pointed out with your crypto asset example, that agreement is incredibly valuable. It has a real value to it. There is some stuff that we can do locally, if you like, and also there is some stuff that doesn't necessarily require, that can be done with multiple authorities across the globe, that doesn't require as much time and to be focused on some of those issues. So we certainly find it really useful. Again, if I go back to my own kind of sort of background and work, we do a lot of work in Xceptor. We share a lot of those ideas with people with other regulators across the globe, and I found that massively beneficial because they're all trying to solve the same problems. So people who have found neat ways of cutting out large chunks of regulatory process that we were having to do at the back end, and I'm sure firms are I know firms are finding this exactly the same thing talking to their counterpart. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed working on DRR and also on working on some of the other POCs with RegTechs and with firms is how open and collaborative the tech environment has been. And I won't name names, but I did hear someone say at one point, we mustn't invite the policy and the legal people in because they'll stop us talking to one another. And actually, it was the techies talking to each other and actually moving things forward that allowed us to go at pace. So I think there's a lot there for us, and there's a lot we're doing. That's certainly how we move forward. That doesn't mean that those policy legal questions go away. They don't. They are still there. Get the wins where you can, and then when you confront those issues, and as you say, there's massive value in confronting them, then it will take time, but they're worth doing.
I read somewhere that, I don't doubt it for a minute, that everything I've heard here confirms that regulators are keen to encourage technology and innovation to help it to be more easy for the regulation for organisations to comply. Having said that, they want to encourage it while still maintaining and retaining a level of risk management on that, so it doesn't become anarchy out there. And it just strikes me, and I agree with everything you've said about why you'd have these sandpits to help inform thinking, to help inform how you would, if you want to regulate X, Y, and Z, how can we do it? By having these hackathons or technologies to understand how this could be solved, that's great. But having them inside the tent so you can work with them is absolutely the right way to understand what would work and perhaps what the risks are outside the tent as well. And just seems to inform a hell of a lot of thinking. And it would also address and preempt some challenges. And Nicole, you picked up on the AI and the GDPR, stuff like that. If this was done in a hackathon way back when, these things would have been addressed earlier, or at least thought about earlier, and the regulation put in place, or the technology, or some sort of way forward that wasn't going to create these conflicts. So I sound like I'm repeating myself, and I'm a tech vendor of RegTech, so I would put that in my answer, but it does seem to make a lot of sense, and I think the FCA should be applauded for what they did.
Yeah, I think I'd absolutely agree with that. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left for Q&A for the panel, and we have some mics roaming around if anybody has any questions.
Hello panel, it's Adam Hextall from BT FinTech. Just a question, I think, Nicole, you mentioned about it takes up to 5 years for policy to actually get to come to fruition with the FCA. Does that not mean that regulation can be sort of backward looking? Because obviously I worked at Bloomberg for many years, and clearly markets move very quickly. I'm just wondering whether they're sort of always playing catch up.
So regulation's meant to be technology neutral, and it's meant to be forward looking. I say that on one hand. And then on the other hand, and I'm not going to name which regulator it was because I will get in trouble, but I remember about 2 years ago, a regulator in the US turned around and said, we've got all of these new innovations coming in, all of this new technology, and we have all of this regulation that was written without any of this technology in mind. And whilst our regulation might be technology neutral, it doesn't even think about technology. I personally don't think a lot of it works, and at some point we'll need to rewrite all of it. So on one hand, you probably are correct that some of it is backward looking, but it's not meant to be. But also, we have a lot of regulation which does work. You know, not everything has to be done on technology, and not every regulation doesn't work because you have technology. I mentioned the GDPR because the GDPR for me was, on one hand, an excellent initiative to protect people's data. And on that side, on that principled side, I think it's excellent. But I do think I don't like the word problems because I used to work at a law firm and I was told every problem was an opportunity. So I think there are opportunities within the GDPR to clarify certain things to make it work better for innovation, and which would then help the UK, other European states to do more things in the AI space and also in the blockchain space to create new products for consumers and challenge other jurisdictions when it comes to pushing ahead in innovation. So I know it's half answering your question because half of it I'm slightly agreeing with you and half of it I'm not, but that's because we do have to work for a lot of regulation. We can't turn around and go, well, every regulation doesn't work, because also that wouldn't be true. And I think regulators do actually spend a lot of time trying to think about how something would work in the future. That's why sometimes regulation can be quite vague to allow some sort of interpretation and also allow case law to help with certain regulations. So, yeah, I've given you a half answer. I hope that's sufficient.
I think we had another question over there.
Yes, just a question just to see if there's any lessons learned beyond the financial services market in spaces like taxation, for example, where there's lots of change on an annual basis which has to get deployed in a fairly complex ecosystem of software vendors to help filers and accountants. But also the likes of the Treasury, for example, would be interested to see how they're working with the Bank of England and the FCA to encourage, and when I say encourage, help fund, for example. And again, beyond from that, finally, just in other highly regulated markets like pharmaceuticals, where that the Red Queen theory of having to run so fast because the landscape is moving so quickly. If there's kind of any experiences beyond the financial services market ecosystem.
Do that? Sure. So, you mentioned at the start the taxation example. So one of the government bodies that we've spoken to a lot is HMRC, who've obviously done a lot to digitise the tax system, and we're looking at one of the projects that we're working on in the PRA, and actually we're collaborating with the FCO on as well, is around machine-readable rules. That feeds into the DRR work, but it's also a standalone piece of work. Now, you could say that the HMRC tax code is effectively a machine-readable rulebook. So we've done a lot of work with them to see, the challenges that they faced, why their problems were slightly different, and there are, as most people in here will know, the more ambiguous, the less binary those choices are, the harder it is. And one of the nice things with tax is it tends to be actually quite binary. Now, that's not to say it's not complicated, but you're in this bucket or you're not in this bucket. In fact, regulation is almost, is often not like that. It's more difficult. So we've had quite good conversations with them about how they've worked on that. Another area, again, sticking with the government actually, is DWP, who have done a lot of work looking at the data that they collect on benefit claimants and how they identify potential issues, whether that be fraud issues or whether that also be areas that are underserved. Looking at large data sets. Very different to the tax example, but not dissimilar to, or I suppose there's a comparison to be made between work that we do looking at large financial systems and looking for anomalies, anomaly detection, that sort of thing, and issues in those. So that's another area we've spoken to. Beyond that, the example which I go back to, and I have to admit I haven't done a huge amount of work in this space, but I just find it really interesting, was one of the most sort of complete compliance apps that I saw was from a brewer who was applying it to their beer. And it was literally looking at standard and safety control around food and drink safety standards, and they were doing it on an app on a phone that they gave to their staff. Now, we've seen banks and insurers doing not dissimilar things. Actually, I think the part from EY before was talking about, you're going into a client meeting and working out, who do you need to be in this meeting with. There are similarities there, and so there is lots that we can learn from across the spectrum. And certainly, one of the things that I certainly find as somebody who spent over 8 years in the Bank of England is that tech is one of the really fun areas to work where we do actually get as much value from talking to somebody who works in the food industry as we do for somebody in finance.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi there. So, open standards would certainly assist in innovation in RegTech. Who should be driving open standards? Banks, regulators, or tech vendors?
Two again.
I'd say all of them. If you want to, if you want to have standards that work across the industry, if I was a startup, I'd be pretty unhappy that it was just the banks that were pushing it. And if I am working at a bank, I'd be very unhappy if it was just the startups that were pushing it. But also, not because I'd be unhappy, I don't think it would be as valuable or as good. And some of the best conversations that I'm party to is when I'm sat in a room across industries with startups, with banks, and with regulators and supervisors. And I think it's normally under Chatham House, but I find that the most valuable because you get to hear lots of different viewpoints, and I might go into a room thinking one thing, and then I might be challenged and come out going, actually, no, I can understand that. Or I might come out thinking, okay, yeah, I was correct. So either way, I think it's very valuable to have a cross-industry view.
Yeah, I definitely second that. I think it's all three. I think it has to involve it. And there are examples of those standards setting bodies working very well. So some of the ISO standards, for example, have been about people talking everyone together to get there. And I think that we will need more of those. And we need more of that collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think of a reason or a case why it wouldn't be that way, really. It wouldn't make sense.
I think this is one of the areas where regulators in particular have been much more open to that debate and that discussion. And I think certainly firms like yours, Nicole, and others, and RegTech providers have been keen to participate as well. So I think there's still lots of scope and space to do that. I'm certainly looking forward to continuing to engage with it. Any other questions? I have a flashing red light, which is telling me that we need to stop. I would just like to say thank you, everybody, for staying with us and for completing the polling question, and particularly to Mike, Peter and Nicole, who have been an excellent panel. So please, for the panel.